لا ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. Hope everyone is doing well. Alhamdulillah. Barakallah fikum. Let us open up the book where we're left. And this was...
Wait a minute, Shay, because I'm still figuring out the technical problem with another co-host. Wait, yeah.
Okay. Okay, just tell me when you want me to start.
أكيد تفضل شيء.
Okay. طيب بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Barakallah fikum. Jazakallah khair. We are starting again with our class on the Science of Hadith, and we have reached the second level, and that is the fair Hadith. It is the Hadith Hasan. Okay, the Hadith Hasan. And this is different than the Hadith Sahih, but as we said, it is still an authentic Hadith, but it's not at that same level as, for example, saying Sahih. Okay, and we looked at the wording and how the scholars have looked at the wording, analyzed the wording to understand which Hadith is more authentic, which one is more deemed to be considered authentic. And that's why the categorization has come in. The categorization is due to these differences. And this is the honesty of the scholars of Hadith who remembered and knew that whoever seeks or lies about the Prophet ﷺ, whoever invents a lie, he will have their place in Jahannam. But they're very careful to make sure that they understand and they only narrate and say about the Hadith, about what's been said from the Prophet ﷺ, only the authentic. And in doing so, obviously, they were able to filter out that which was not authentic. Okay, they're able to filter out that which was not authentic. And that's why these categorization. Okay, that's why the categorization of authentic, not authentic, Hassan, Sahih, and okay. Now, so let us look at معرفة الحسن من الحديث, the fair hadith or the hadith Hasan. I'm not sure why my headphones are sounding very weird. So give me 1 second. I'm trying to change them. All right. So after relating the hadith, according to the scholars, this discipline fall into the three divisions mentioned above. We heard Abu Sulaiman al-Qattabi, may Allah bless him, said, fair is the hadith, the source of which is known and the transmitter of which are famous. They're known. We know the source, we know the transmitter. Most hadith fall into this category, and it is the category which most scholars accept and the generality of jurists employ. We heard that what Abu Isa at-Tirmidhi, rahmallah, Imam at-Tirmidhi, rahmallah, meant by fair is that no one in the isnad of the hadith is accused of falsehood. That is not an anonymous hadith. There's no shadh. Okay? There's no shadh. And that something similar to it is related from more than one line of transmission. Okay? So there's no major defect in the hadith, in the narrators, in the hadith itself. No one's been considered maybe to be someone wrong or someone of a liar, and so on and so forth. Okay? So it's very important to understand. One of the more recent experts said fair is the hadith in which there is a slight but tolerable weakness. Okay, so he means Hasan as opposed to what? To Sahih. Okay, Hasan as opposed to Sahih. So, and there's a tolerable weakness. Maybe one of them forgot. For example, a narrator in the chain might be considered weak if he lost his notes or there was a fire in his house. Something along those lines that could cause some sort of a doubt in his narration, okay? Even though he is a righteous person. He's a good person. But, there was some issue there in him, his notes, and so on, even though it's not something to deal with his character. Right, that's how strict it was. Okay? So, fair is the hadith in which there is a slight but tolerable weakness. It is suitable for use. All of it's ambiguous, and all of this is ambiguous and inadequate. Nothing in the definitions of Tirmidhi and Khattabi distinguishes the fair hadith from the sound one. Do you understand? So al-Khattabi, which we read here, and at-Tirmidhi, you couldn't really understand. Well, what's the difference then? Okay, what is the difference? So the reply is saying that I have examined and researched the question of the fair hadith at length, collecting the scattered remarks of the experts and taking notes of the instances of the usage of this term. It became abundantly clear that there are two subcategories of fair hadith. Okay, so Ibn Salah is talking. He considers others as experts, even though he himself is an expert. You can see the piety and the righteousness. And he explains now. Number one, the hadith, the isnad of which includes an outwardly acceptable individual whose suitability has not been confirmed. And outwardly is good. He's a righteous person, outwardly. Okay. Outwardly is okay. But it's not fully established. Can't really say, yeah, this person is for sure. Okay, we can believe it. So it's not being confirmed, okay? Yet, this individual is not careless. He's not prone to mistakes in what he transmits, nor accused of falsehood in hadith. That is, he manifests neither the practice of deliberate lying in hadith nor any other reason for vitiating his integrity. In addition, it has become known that a text like that of the Hadith or one similar to it has been transmitted to one or more different lines of transmission. Meaning, it's not the only Hadith that talks about this. There are other contexts and other that actually corroborate this Hadith. Okay, in this way, the Hadith is reinforced by the parallelism of someone else being in conformity with this transmitter, with something like it, or by another attestation of it. That is the appearance of another hadith with a similar text. This way, the possibility that it is anomalous or unfamiliar, munkar, is excluded. The remarks of Tirmidhi concern this subcategory of fair hadith. Okay, so as long as the hadith has a person, but he's not fully established, but he's not known to lie. He's not known to deceive. He's not known to be a bad person, but he's not like fully established. He's not super known. He didn't prove himself in the community. But there's no doubt about him. Plus, this hadith is also strengthened, okay, strengthened within other narrations, parallel narrations. And we will see the difference between lidhati and lighayri, and what does it mean and how does it reach a yani sahih level. Okay, but there'll be a difference. There'll be a difference. A Hasan hadith that is strengthened through other means, and we'll see how it will climb its reliability. No. Number two, the hadith, the transmitter, which is someone famous for veracity and honesty, who, however, did not attain the grade of transmitter of sound hadith because he fell short of them in retention and exactitude. Okay, so now this person is not like the other person. The other person is not known to have any mistakes. He has strong memory. He doesn't make mistakes, he doesn't forget. This person now is okay, he's known, but there's some problems because he has some retention and exactitude, meaning like being certain and being exact in what's narrated. Despite that, his state is superior to that of the transmitter whose hadith are counted as unfamiliar if he is alone in transmitting them. Okay. For all of this, the hadith must be first be considered to be secure from being defective, okay, mu'allal, as well as secure from being anomalous or unfamiliar. The remarks of al-Khattabi concerning the second category of hadith. So, what we have said brings together the scattered comments of those who remarks on the fair hadith as coming to our attention. At-Tirmidhi, al-Khattabi, and so on. Okay, so let's look now at an enumeration of the principal aspects of the fair hadith, and we will know with clarity the matter throughout the discussion. Okay, so now they're trying to explain the difference in what is a sahih hadith. He has explained there's two issues. Okay, if you look at it, mostly related to the narrator. Is he someone who is known, reliable, but he's not attained the highest level, but he's not known to lie or twist or forget or so on and so on, to make mistakes in his accuracy. Then there is someone who is not so accurate, might have some forgetfulness, but he's known and established in the community and he is very trustworthy. Okay? Now, whenever a Shafi'i jurist regards that with skepticism, we remain behind him of the provision of Shafi'i rahimahullah concerning the loose hadith, marasil, of the followers, that he accepted a loose hadith, hadith mursal, for which there is a similar supported version, a musnad. Okay? Likewise, he accepted a loose hadith if another loose hadith transmitted by someone who has not studied with the teacher of the first followers, meaning Sahaba, was in agreement with it. Okay? So this is a Shafi'i statement. Shafi'i said this in some of his remarks where he speaks of several ways Several ways determining the soundness of the source of a loose hadith on the basics of its coming from another line of transmission. Okay, a mursal, a loose hadith, it's a mursal. We also remind the skeptical Shafi'ite that Abu al-Muzaffar al-Samani and others related from one of the students of Shafi that the transmission of an outwardly acceptable transmitter excuse me, is to be accepted, even if the testimony of an outwardly acceptable individual may not be accepted in court. And there's a cognate reason for that. So how could a Shafi'i, or a Shafi'ite, not a Shafi'ite, meaning a follower of the Shafi'i madhab, object? When for a hadith to be considered fair, we would not be satisfied in accordance with the foregoing remarks by its mere relation with an outwardly acceptable individual. God knows best. So here's a bit confusing, okay, about this, because the difference of opinion amongst the Shafi'is and what al-Salah says and so on. So I don't need you guys to necessarily understand this. It's not that important. I'll tell you when you don't need to really pay attention, as in like remember. Okay? What you need to understand here, okay, what you need to understand is that some hadith will have slight weakness in them. Either the person is not fully established, he's not a liar, not fully established, or there is some small forgetfulness, but there are other hadith that are parallel, okay, that strengthen us, right? Now here, he talks about we find hadith judged as weak despite their having been related with many isnads throughout numerous lines of transmissions, like the hadith, the ears are part of the head, and similar ones. So these hadith are narrated by different isnads, parallel, but they are still weak. Okay, so they're explaining to you, hey, just because, even though we said that a hadith will be Hasan, if it's related through parallel means, but here there are some hadith that are not authentic whatsoever. Now, why do you not include the hadith and others like it in the category of fair hadith? Because the various variation reinforce one another in the fashion you previously described, right? So it makes sense. The answer to this is that not every weakness in the hadith is eliminated by the hadith coming from several lines of transmission. Situation varies. One weakness, which the passage of a hadith through several lines of transmission eliminates, is the weakness which arises from some deficiency in the retention of its transmitter when he is otherwise pious, a righteous person. So when you have multiple chains, what that protects against is that some information might have been overlooked due to the weakness in memory. You cannot. If so many people have narrated it from different chains, you cannot say that something was forgotten. Okay? When we see that the hadith he relates also comes from another line of transmission, we realize that there's one of the hadith that he had retained properly and his accuracy in it was not impaired. Okay? Very clear. Likewise, when the weakness of the hadith is on account of looseness, irsal, it disappears because of something along the lines, as in the case of the loose hadith, which an expert authority transmits as loose, since it contains just a small weakness, which disappears through its relation to another line of transmission. You understand? So, an example of this is the weakness which arises from the transmitter being accused of falsehood or from the hadith being anomalous. This is an outline, the particular which are acquired through practice and study. So be aware of that. It is one of the fine points, and God knows best. So what we take from this, okay, what we want to take from this is that even in some cases, if there is parallel hadith coming from different isnads, it can strengthen the knowledge that's in that, or the matan, what the hadith contains, but sometimes it depends. It doesn't necessarily reach the level of authenticity. So you have to look at not one or the other. You have to look at Everything. Is the guy reliable? Does he have weakness in memory? Is the hadith strengthened by other ahadith? Okay, what does that mean? What if there is still some irsal, some disconnection? It's loose. It's not connected to the source, even though it comes from a variety of parallel narrations. Still, it would not necessarily suffice to be considered. To be considered what? To be considered sahih. If the transmitter of hadith lags behind the grade of those who are retentive and exact, meaning he's not so accurate, yet is widely known for veracity and respectability. He's known to be a righteous man, but he lags behind, he forgets maybe. And in addition to that, his hadith were related through more than one line of transmission. The strength of the hadith is reinforced from both sides. That lifts his hadith from the grade of fair to the grade of sound. Okay, and this is where we get into, as I told you, it can be lifted. So hadith Hasan, why is it Hasan again and not Sahih? Anyone? It's because the person has some lagging. He has maybe some forgetfulness. It's not exact what he narrates. Therefore, his level fell down from Sahih to Hasan. You understand? If I forget something and I'm not super accurate, I don't pay attention to say the exact words, the scholars hadith, when they collect it, they will actually take in consideration even that demeanor, that attitude. They'll say, well, everything is good. The hadith is connected to the source. There are narrations. There is tawatur to support it. However, it is Hasan. Why? Because the person, even though he's known for respectability, he lagged behind of retention, memory, and exactness. Okay? Simple. However, if there are other hadith, many hadith, same wording, it strengthens it from both sides, then it lifts the hadith from a grade of fair to the grade of sound. So now it's not Hasan anymore, it becomes Sahih. The hadith becomes Sahih. Understand? If it didn't have any to grade or any parallel hadith to support it, it would not become Sahih because the man forgets and he is not super accurate. He is not a liar. He is not a deceiver. He just has some lapses in memory, as these scholars have realized. So therefore, they lower the hadith level. Okay. However, there's 2, 3, 4 more parallel hadith, same wording, same concept, same. Now it's raised back to Sahih, goes back to Sahih. Okay. Wanted to make sure that you understand. Now give the hadith narrated by Abu Huraira. This is an instance here. Muhammad bin Amr from Abu Salma, from Abu Huraira, the Prophet ﷺ said, were it not that I would be imposing a burden on my community, on my ummah, I would have ordered them to clean their teeth with miswak before every prayer. Muhammad bin Amr al-Alqamah was renowned for veracity and piety, but he lacked exactitude. Righteous man, but some people, if you tell them to say a story, they'll like mix some words and they'll like summarize things. They won't be exact. Good, nice, amazing people, but they won't be fully exact. This is Muhammad bin Amr bin Alqamah. He was like that. So some regarded him as weak on account of his poor retention, while others deemed him reliable because of his righteousness. Thus, his hadith from this standpoint is only fair. It's not sahih. It is hasan. When the circumstances this hadith related through other lines of transmission was combined with that, our fears about his poor retention vanish, and that slight shortcoming was amended. So this isnad was established as sahih, and the hadith attained the level of a sound hadith, that was sahih hadith, and Allah knows best. Okay, guys understand? Perfect example, and the hadith is very famous. So this hadith is Sahih. Okay, it's been lifted to Sahih because there are other narrations that support it. Now, the book of Abu Isa at-Tirmidhi, Abu Isa, rahimahullah, at-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah, is a fundamental document for recognition of hadith. He is one who referred to this category of hadith by this name, and he used the term often in his Jami' al-Tirmidhi. The term fair is also scattered throughout the remarks of some of the teachers and the members of the generation scholars, like Imam Ahmed, Bukhari, and others. So, At-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah, even when he connected the Shamal, what we studied, the description of Prophet, there is many hadith Hasan there, there's many hadith authentic, there's some hadith that are debatable. Yani, he put it because in that matter of description of the Prophet, ﷺ, again, there's a lot of hadith and they corroborate each other and so on. And there's no harm in looking at those. Now, let's go down. I don't want you to necessarily. No, let's look at number 5. Point number 5. Okay. The author of Mashabih, lamps, God may Allah bless him, came to divide his hadith in 2 categories. The sound and the fair. By sound, he meant the hadith appearing in one of both the Sahih, i.e. Bukhari, Muslim. And by fair, the hadith Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, and their peers, including their compilations. This is a usage unrecognized by others. The scholars hadith do not consider the fair hadith to consist of that. Yeah, so you would consider anything that's authentic, Bukhari, Muslim, anything that's Sahih in Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, and so on, which is not necessarily the way to go, as the scholar said. The musnads, like those of Abu Dawud and Abu Musa, Ubaidullah Musa bin Musa, of course, Ahmed bin Hanbal, and others, do not reach the level of the 5 books. That is, the 5 books are the 2 Sahih, Bukhari and Muslim, Abu Dawood, An-Nisai, and Tirmidhi. These are the 6, but some people say Sahih al-Sitta. Sahih al-Sitta, they consider 6 books. Actually, in general term, usually people refer to them as the 6 books, authentic books. Okay? So it will be Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, An-Nisai, At-Tirmidhi, and does anyone know? The 6th usually will be, okay, that's good homework for everyone, inshallah, to know which one is the 6th. Okay, so, and no, it is not the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. Okay, we'll see why and how, even though the Musnad, it is a very strong and authentic book. And Musnad, there are many Musnads. Okay, it's not only one, but the famous one, of course, is the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. Just like there are many Muwattas. There are Muwattas. Quite a few people wrote Muwattas. But the famous one is that of Imam Malik, rahimahullah, Imam Medina. Muwatta, Imam Malik. Okay. Malik ibn Anas, rahimahullah. Now, the statement of scholars, this is the hadith sound from the standpoint of its isnad, or fair from the standpoint of its isnad, hasan al-isnad, sahih al-isnad. Okay, when we speak only about isnad, matan. Isnad is the chain, matan is the hadith. But when a person says that it's sound from the standpoint of the isnad, or hasan from the isnad, is not the same as saying this hadith is sound or fair, because sometimes it said this hadith sound from the standpoint of isnad. And the hadith is not actually sound on account of being anomalous or defective. However, when reliable author says nothing more than that, it is sound for the standpoint of isnad, and he does not go on to bring up a defect in it or impugn it or presumption from that this is that he judged it to be intrinsically sahih. Okay, so what this means is, yani when you say that this is Hasan al-Isnad, then Isnad is okay, but there still can be some issues in the hadith. Keep in mind, there's two things. There's the Isnad, and then there's the matan, or the actual hadith itself. Okay, but that's what I said. The scholars are very clear and very careful with saying things. He's not going to say this hadith is fully authentic. He's going to say from the point of the chain, it is authentic. All right. And there's a difference. When I say the hadith is authentic and the chain is authentic, the two are different. Okay. It doesn't make it yet. So saying a hadith is different. Hadithun sahih versus Hasan or Sahih al-Isnad is different. Okay, is different. Which one is stronger? Hadith is Sahih. Hadith is Sahih. Okay, Sahih al-Isnad is strong, but not as strong as when you say Hadith is Sahih. And again, the ulama, you might think that these differences are so minute and detailed and there's so much, but that's to the extent that they have explained, like that's so detailed because it's such an amana. And the people who attack hadith, they really do not know what that they're talking about, how meticulous it's been preserved and how strong the system is, that it does not allow for people to just do whatever. Now, number 8. Okay, our sister's asking about al-Salah tasbih. Okay, Salah tasbih. Inshallah, we can look into it as to why some of the scholars. Again, it will be usually due to some defect in the narration. Okay, that's why. Okay, so this is why. Also, it is not very, very like Salatul Istikhara, for example, right? It's not the same. Okay, you have to understand, it's not the same. If you know Salatul Tasbih, it's mostly prayed in certain countries. Okay, you'll find it, yani Malaysia and a few other countries. And a lot of times it is done, I think maybe in Egypt too, they pray sometimes. Okay, among some of the Shafis. But it will be just I don't want to get too much in depth into it, but it is just remember that it is due to authenticity disputes. Okay. Now a person can say, well, because there's a difference of opinion, can I not just take that opinion? Well, depends on how strong the evidence is and how clear versus the opinion. There can be an opinion versus the evidence. Complicated, brothers and sisters, but again, we try to stay from anything in ibadah that can be bid'ah and is not fully established. And because it's such a disputed thing, you would naturally would like to stay away from it because it's such a disputed thing. You don't want to do something that will be classified as a bid'ah. وَكُلُّ بِدْعَةٍ ضَلَالَةٍ وَكُلُّ ضَلَالَةٍ فِي النَّارِ. And it might lead to hellfire. We don't want to do that. And with all due respect, it's better to just pray 2 rakas to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Make sincere dua. Follow that Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ of doing tahajjud, it's much better than Salatul Tasbih or some of the things that are disputed amongst the ulama. Stick within the things that are acceptable. Do not press the limits of the unknown or the disputed. Okay? Al-haram bayn wal-halal bayn. Now, let's go to number 9. There are some scholars of hadith who do not recognize fair hadith as a separate category, subsuming them into types of sound hadith, since they are included in types of hadith which may be adduced as proofs. Abdullah al-Hakim, this was his adherence, okay? He did not make a difference between al-Sahih wa al-Hadith al-Hasan, okay? Again, this does not really concern us. Let's go down. I don't want to get you into too much detail. So, we are now at Ma'rifatul Da'if min al-Hadith, category number 3. So, let us review really quickly. Number 1, Hadith al-Sahih, Ma'rifatul Sahih min al-Hadith. Number 2, Ma'rifatul Hasan min al-Hadith. And number 3, Ma'rifatul Da'if min al-Hadith. 3 levels so far. 2 we covered, Sahih. We looked at the chain has to be connected. We looked at the differences in the Sahih Hadith, authentic, that it needs to be connected to a person. But some of the types and so on, some of the famous Hadith, some are not so famous, as well as how the wording can change. Yani سمعنا versus قال versus يقول versus حدثنا, and so on and so forth. Each word makes a difference. Then we moved on to Hasan, which does not fully achieve the level of Sahih. Because what? As we've seen, well, in many cases, it's just the person who narrates might have a slight weakness in remembering or being very, very accurate. And we looked at that. We also looked at how those hadith can be lifted to the position of a Sahih hadith when it's reinforced through different chains of narration coming from different parts. Now let's look at the weak hadith. Okay, weak hadith. And a person who does not understand weak hadith, they can easily be misguided. There was a scholar who gave a lecture in one of the villages. So you have to speak to people on their level and to be careful. But he was explaining something. He was reading a hadith and he says, هذا حديث ضعيف. He said, this is a weak hadith. So the people got angry and upset. Almost they wanted to beat him up. Because they said, you are weak. How can you say the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is weak? You understand? They said, you are weak. And he tried to explain to them what does it mean. But again, most people not know the knowledge of mustalah al-hadith or the sciences of hadith or ulum al-hadith, yani, classification. They will not know. Therefore, they might hear things and they might not understand and be confused. And that's why you, inshallah, you won't be confused and you'll understand the differences between Sahih, Hasan, Daif. Right now, the main difference that you need to understand is between Hadith, Sahih, and Hasan is that maybe the person has some weakness and so on. Okay? Now, there's a weakness in the chain somewhere, not necessarily lying, not someone. It's just that the person might have forgotten. Some might have happened. And then his level has gone down a notch. So it's not Sahih, it is now Hasan. However, if there can be other narrations that support what he's saying, basically his level will be lifted back up to Hadith Sahih. All right, cool. So let's go back now to 3. Weak Hadith. Every Hadith in which the traits of the sound Hadith, Sahih, okay, which we know what they are, and the fair Hadith above do not come together, this is a weak. So they're not fully connected. The people there might be doubtful. There is no other hadith to necessarily corroborate or to mention that it is correct. And this can come to a lot of problems. Now, it can lead to major weakness. Okay. Some scholars went in creating subcategories of weak hadith, coming up to 49 subcategories. So I don't need you to obviously do that. Just like Ibn Salah says, he will not look at that. The process, the procedure someone who seeks to expound at length on this topic is to take a particular trait of sound or the fair hadith and make the hadith that lack the trait a separate subcategory of weak hadith. Okay. So again, we don't want to get caught up into the categories, but you can just look at the following categories, which is mawdu'. Okay. So from the hadith da'if, there's mawdu', forged. This is a lie. Mawdu' is a lie. This is one of the biggest sins, to lie on a hadith. Then there's the mixed up, maqlub. It's not necessarily a lie, but it might have been mixed up. It might have been a mistake. Then we have the shadh, okay, which is anomalous. It's got some problems. Defective, mu'allal, disrupted, okay, muttarib, the loose one, the mursal, the interrupted one, the munqati, and the problematic one, mu'adal. Okay. So, the explanation of these will appear in later chapters, inshallah. It will be noted the categories we will be presenting, and they are general categories of Science Hadith and not specifically categories of the original system. We don't want to go too much into that. Okay. But these are, you're going to have to probably understand these a little bit. We'll go into it, inshallah. So, 3 main categories. Now we reached Mawdu', the weak hadith. Again, if a hadith is not Mawdu', forged, okay, it is not a lie. It could be يعني مرسل, معدل, منقطع. Then we have to look further. Okay, it's not considered necessarily a lie. Okay. Now, supported hadith or Ma'rifatul Musnad. This is the supported hadith. Okay, so it starts from the Musnad. Okay. We're gonna understand what that means. Now, Musnad, obviously, you will have, and you'll know the word of the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. Okay, the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. So let's go to Ma'rifat al-Musnad. So the experts, again, Abu Bakr al-Khatib, say that the scholars of Hadith hold the supported Hadith to be one with an isnad which coheres from the person transmitting it up to its point of termination. Okay, so it's linked. Most often the term is applied to the Hadith which came from the Prophet ﷺ, read in the Hadith which originated from the companions and others. Okay. So there are some hadith, yes, even those are called hadith, that originate, meaning the last person in the chain who says it is the Sahaba, like Umar Khattab, for example. Okay. It's still hadith. Why? Because, for example, the subject matter, if he doesn't just give a certain opinion, the scholars say that the Sahaba learned from the Prophet ﷺ. No way they'll just say something without having heard from the Prophet ﷺ, especially when it's supported by other evidences. Okay. Now, So most of the term applied to the hadith which came from the Prophet ﷺ, rather than the hadith which originated with the companions and others. The ex-Bab Omar stated that the supported hadith are exclusively those raised, rufi'a, to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay? Meaning, yani the raised to him. This not may be uninterrupted. It is muttasil, like Malik from Nafi from Ibn Umar, from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Or it may be interrupted, which is munqati, like Malik from Zuhri, from Ibn Abbas, from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The second hadith is supported since it does not goes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it is interrupted, so it is a musnad. It has an isnad, it's supported, but it is interrupted because Zuhri did not hear from Ibn Abbas. Zuhri, and you were not caught it. How would you know? So Malik heard from Zuhri. Az-Zuhri from Ibn Abbas from Prophet. Okay, where's the problem? The problem is at Az-Zuhri, in the middle. You understand? He did not hear from Ibn Abbas. May Allah be pleased with him. Abu Omar related from several scholars the view that the term supposed applies only to the hadith when an uninterrupted is not raised to the Prophet ﷺ. The expert stated that unambiguously and did not mention any other definitions book. Okay, so this is how the scholars are going to look at it. Did a person narrate from someone? Why is it coming from there? And what's the mistake and what's the problem? Okay, it will make sense, inshallah, when we will summarize. Uninterrupted hadith. Actually, let's stop here. Let's stop here. And next time I will prepare a little summary for what we've covered so far. Okay, so we've covered up to supported hadith, Ma'rifatul Musnad. Okay, and I'll try to give you some easier, but we need to go through the book, but I'll give you a little bit of simplified, inshallah. But what I want you to remember is the different names, the different types. How does this benefit you? Because now when you read the hadith and you go to the bottom of it, you go to the bottom of the hadith, now you might see hadithun hasan. And you're going to be like, oh, okay. So, is it sahih? Now I know why it's hasan. It could be because there's a problem there. So now you have a different view of how things are. Also, when someone tried to say something to you, hey, we should do this, ibadah, and you say, okay, so what's the evidence for that? Polite matter, right? And, they'll say, oh, this hadith. And we're like, well, but is it authentic? Is it sahih or hasan? The person might not even know what these things mean. And you have to tell them that, hey, we can't just take things just like that without knowing whether this is authentic or not. Or is this mawdu', that is fabricated, which would be a huge problem. Okay? So, inshallah, we'll continue next time. And I will also make a review with some simpler example, inshallah. Barakallah fikum. Jazakumullah khair. Subhanak wa bihamdika. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi jazakallah khair.
Wa iyyakum. Barakallah fikum.